Hi everyone, and welcome back to game 7 and 8 in the match. Magnus is now 2 points ahead in the match, going into the final few games, and this is going to put a lot of pressure into Nepomniachtchi in order to take some more risk or change things up in terms of his opening choices. So we'll have a quick look at game 7, which again results in a row Lopez. This time we'll have a look from Magnus's point of view. We get the same sort of anti-marshal with pawn to a4 on move 8, and again rook b8 was played in this particular game. We had some exchanges of the pawns and h3 was played. Pawn to d6, pawn to d3, h6. This is the similar system to what Magnus played in the previous game as well, where he opted for this rook e8 move. This time though, instead of putting the knight to d2, white opted to play the move knight to c3, which I think is fairly harmless. And after the exchange, we see that the pawn structure is fairly symmetrical. Knight e7 was played, a common idea, so this knight will often reroute to g6 in a lot of these e4, e5 positions. We have the move bishop to e3, looking for perhaps bishop to a7 in some instances. Magnus just exchanges off these light squared bishops with bishop e6. And then we have the move pawn to d4. We have an exchange, which is probably the first imbalance of this whole game. But after bishop takes b3, queen takes, knight g6, we see that Magnus is attacking this pawn on e4. And he's going to follow up with the move pawn to c5. And there's going to be a lot of exchanges in the center. After the move pawn to c5, not only do we get rid of this backward pawn that we have on c7, but we're going to mass liquidate in the center. And white doesn't really want to push d5. For example, after rook c1, pawn goes to c5. d5 doesn't want to be played because not only is this pawn hanging, this structure in general gives black a lot of counterplay with this potentially passed pawn on the queen side. So Nepo decides to play the move pawn to e5 here and is really forced to liquidate in the center. We have the move queen to f5. Of course we can't take it because pawn takes would give white winning chances. So queen f5, pawn takes, we have captures, and bishop captures, rook captures, and knight takes e5 here, leading to a symmetrical position. Of course white can't take here because knight takes f3 would open up some discoveries on the rook, and we have exchanges to follow and basically a drawn ending here, 3v3. So a relatively peaceful game 7 we had. But the interesting one I really want to talk about is game 8, where even though we had a decisive result, the opening choice from Magnus was particularly interesting, I thought. So we had the move pawn to e4 in that game, and Magnus with the white pieces again playing against the Petrov. Very solid opening, and I think basically if you're playing the Petrov, you're playing to equalize as black. It's not really a winning try, but yeah, we'll see what Jan comes up with in the following matches, because I think he really needs to switch it up from the Petrov to get any sort of imbalance positions. Because if Magnus wants to just say that he doesn't want to push, he's happy with a draw, then it's very, very hard to win. There's thousands of ways you can equalize and just hold a draw against the Petrov. So Magnus plays the move pawn to d4. Knight takes e4, bishop d3. Pawn goes to d5. Knight takes on e5. Knight to d7. Now knight takes d7, bishop takes d7. So this is a relatively well-known line, and here white has a few options. Even before here, actually, white has a few options of playing knight c3, and this leads to some very sharp play. And even if he plays the move knight takes d7, bishop takes d7, knight c3 here, this is relatively well-known, and it leads to somewhat more imbalanced positions where white retains some decent winning tries. But of course this has all been analyzed, and I very much doubt that this would have come any surprise at all to Jan. So it's very interesting at this level that you're trying to look for any psychological edge as you possibly can in your games. And Magnus, almost now, it should come as no surprise that he's always going to play these type of moves, which are often fine in the opening, but they may be something that you haven't looked at or something you just haven't spent much time considering, and your team may have just completely overlooked it. So this is one of those moves which is pretty much fine for white, but fine for black, I mean, but it may come as a surprise because Jan didn't spend much time considering it, especially as a serious option. So here black has a few choices. Like f5 is actually one playable choice that black can choose here, but what Jan played is very natural. Knight takes d2, bishop takes d2, and it almost feels like it's a draw offer from white. I'm playing knight d2, I'm keeping the position symmetrical, and I'm happy with a draw. But things are not always what it seems on the surface, and if you look at the position a little bit more, you see that there's actually a little bit of sting in this position, especially after what Jan played. He played the move bishop to d6. I think he played this move a little bit too quickly. He only spent roughly a minute or so on this move, and I think queen e7 is perhaps a bit more accurate, because here if white goes queen e2, of course it's just a draw. If bishop e3, I don't believe this idea of sacking the pawn on b2 is quite enough for white, and I think black should be okay in this position, but this is probably what Jan didn't want to go into here. But potentially white had some preparation, but I don't believe that this should be bad for black at all. So that should be an option, and of course king f1 is an option, and white may be looking to play h4, very similar to what Jan did with the black side. But again, I don't really believe that this should be anything significant for white. So queen e7 is definitely a really good option, but bishop d6 was played very quickly, met by the move castles kingside, and now black has a couple of different things which are problematic. The main issue is that he can't easily castle because queen h5 comes, and now we're hitting this pawn on h7, so you're committed to make some weaknesses on the king side. I mean, you can't even go g6 because queen takes d5 might follow. So you might have to play the move pawn to f5 here, but this is particularly unpleasant. I think white can follow with the move bishop g5 first, and then maybe queen f3 followed by bishop f4, rook e1. And we see the difference in pawn structure here is that black is weak in this e5 square, and this is something that white can fight for and try to attack later on. I think white has a slightly more favorable position here after, let's say, queen e8, queen f3 followed by rook e1, bishop f4. Of course, if you don't castle, then the alternative options are also not so pleasant perhaps. Bishop e6 is one option, but again it doesn't look that great. You can answer with the move queen h5 again, and perhaps even follow up with bishop g5, trying to provoke some weaknesses in black's position, just making it difficult. Of course, you're not ever castling kingside anymore with a queen on h5. There's also perhaps options of moving the king, which is similar to what happened in the actual game. In the game, black played the move pawn to h5 first, and this provoked a long think from white. I don't think Magnus may have expected this move at all, but this is a very, very risky move, of course, pushing this h-pawn. So black is taking away this square on h5 from the queen, but at the same time it's not clear like what is black doing with his king. So after the move pawn to h5, after a long think, Magnus went for the move queen e1. A bit unexpected. I don't think anyone really saw that move coming, but a lot of people were saying the move pawn to c4 here might have been a very tempting option for white, and I agree here that pawn to c4 might have been a good try, but it's not easy to see the following moves in advance, I think. For example, here black has a couple of options. Probably the main one is going to be either queen h4 or pawn takes followed by queen h4 or perhaps queen f6. These are what white needs to spend time looking at. Okay, so queen h4 probably doesn't work because g3, and then white has a lot of compensation after sacrificing the pawn. Also, the black king is stuck in the center. So perhaps pawn takes is a little bit better. But after pawn takes, I think there's a variation here after queen to h4 that is actually very dangerous for black. Goes something like rook e1. And here after king f8, white can look at playing the move queen to f3, attacking this pawn on f7. And even though this pawn is attacked on h2, we're setting up a much stronger threat here. And the fact is that black doesn't have any good checks to follow up. For example, queen takes h2 is met by the move king f1, and already white is in a completely winning position. For example, queen check is met by king e2, and if rook check, we have the move king to d3, and now already white is winning because of the mating threat as well as the queen hanging. And the other variation was pawn to f6 and queen d5 with the unstoppable threat of queen f7. But of course, it's not easy to see. And whenever you're making an imbalance in the position like this, it's very critical that you spend a lot of time deciding whether you do want to give yourself a long-term weakness like this IQP. In this position, we're getting a lot of active pieces for the isolated queen's pawn, so in that aspect, it's probably totally fine. But after a move such as queen f6, we could play maybe queen b3, and I think it should be still in white's favor. You could throw in the check first if you want as well, followed by queen b3. But of course, it's something a little bit riskier that we have to consider. And perhaps because of the tournament situation, Magnus didn't want to risk so much. He wanted to just put some slight pressure. And that's probably why he opted for queen e1. King f8 and bishop to b4. Of course, I was surprised that queen e7 wasn't played right away, but it's played now. So it's transposing. Bishop takes, queen takes, and queen d2. So this is very risk-free play from white. Just saying that I'm basically happy with a draw if black defends accurately, but of course I'm going to put some slight pressure and try to see if I can provoke a mistake. So rook e8, rook to e1, rook h6 was played. So black has managed to artificially castle, although the pieces are still a little bit more passive than white's. Queen g5, pawn to c6, exchanges, and rook to e1. So here black doesn't have time to exchange a pair of rooks because the h pawn is hanging. Queen f6. White avoids the queen trade, of course, because keeping the queens on gives a lot more winning chances, and white is never in any danger. I mean, we can trade the queens at any time. So h3, h4. And here Magnus decides to unbalance the position a little bit with the move pawn to c4, because his pieces have become a lot more active, and there's no real plan here for white apart from c4. If you don't play c4, there's not much you can do apart from trading pieces. So after pawn takes c4, bishop takes c4, here Jan made the game costing blunder with the move pawn to b5, which in fact dropped material. But if he doesn't play the move pawn to b5, I think he still has very decent chances here to hold a draw. But already we can still see some slight pressure building up. For example, king g8 is a move, but perhaps you don't want to play such a move because it allows the queen to invade on the 7th rank at some point. And yeah, and unless you're absolutely sure that everything is holding, then yeah, this is not a move a human really wants to play. At the same time, moves such as a6 look very, very unappealing. But I think he just missed this whole idea of b5, and then white can play the move queen a3 check. Because after queen a3 check, not only is the pawn hanging, but after we capture the pawn, then the bishop on d7 is also hanging. So king g8, we have the move queen takes a7. And now white is just a whole pawn up after the move bishop to b3 here. Rook d6, rook to e4 is played. Bishop e6, so we have some trades. But this endgame, white is just a clear pawn up. So we have queen c5, queen a5, queen takes c6, king h2, queen takes e6. Okay, so the queen goes to a square where it's basically covering any perpetuals, so black can't do any queen g3, queen e1 ideas. And from here, the winning plan is just to capture the rest of the pawns and promote one of our passed pawns. Here, the queen on e5 is excellent because it just stops all checks along this diagonal, and the rest is quite easy for Magnus after queen f3. Okay, so there were a lot of practical problems over the board. I think that Magnus's opening choice posed in this particular game for Jan, and it's very interesting to see what will happen from this point on, because now with a 2-point lead, things are very different going into the final, I believe, 6 games, and it basically forces your opponent to go into a situation where he's going to have to take major risks with both colors, really, and especially coming up next with the white pieces, it's a very good opportunity to see if he can bring something onto the table. And I think perhaps we might be seeing some sort of gambits coming in, perhaps. We're not sure, but I think he needs to switch something up from sort of the Ro Lopez lines we've been seeing so far in the match, because Magnus has been showing that black has been absolutely fine there. So thanks for watching this, and I hope to see you in the next games. Catch you then.